The coupling on the winch cable guide at the 160-foot mark had been listed as a routine swap on the district maintenance sheet since April. The FAA decommissioned the tower in 2009, handed the ground lease back to BLM, and whatever nav-aid function it had once served got folded into newer systems further west. What was left was a self-supporting guide lattice structure, 60 years old, standing on a concrete pad in the middle of about 40 acres of scrub and sage, 11 miles down a washboard access road east of Burns. My outfit had the maintenance contract on about 40 decommissioned sites across the eastern Oregon district, and Foxtrot 91 was one of them. Every few years a structural flag would pop up in the system, and I'd add it to a run. This time, the run included a repeater station up near Crane and a defunct Vorbox by Diamond. So I loaded the company F-250 Monday morning, with 3 days of food and water, my tooling, and drove out with Foxtrot 91 as the first stop. The tower itself is worth describing because the tower is the whole story. It is a guide lattice type, which means the main vertical structure is braced outward at multiple heights by wire cables, guys running from the tower to ground anchors in a circle around the base. The main structure is roughly 18 inches across at the bottom and tapers going up. The steel is painted safety orange in the lower third and left bare galvanized above that. There is a bolted ladder running up the north face inside a safety cage, a series of steel hoops spaced about 18 inches apart that keep you from falling backward off the rungs. The ladder goes to the top, which is at 240 feet, but the relevant level for my work order was 160 feet, where there is a maintenance platform. That platform is a steel bar grating section, about 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, welded to the inner structural members on a pair of angle iron cross pieces. It was designed to give a technician a place to stand while servicing the guide pulleys for the equipment winch. The winch itself is down in the equipment shelter at the base, a hand crank unit mounted to the back wall of the shelter, with a steel cable running up through guide pulleys to a hook point at the 160 platform. The coupling on the uppermost guide pulley had sheared. Until I replaced it, the winch was useless. I got up to the 160 platform at 9 in the morning. Clear sky, maybe 55 degrees. No wind worth mentioning. From up there you can see maybe 30 miles in clean conditions. East is high desert flats and rimrock. West is the edge of the Warner Mountains. North is open range running to nothing visible. South is more flats broken by low ridgeline. No towns in sight from that position. There is one paved road cutting northwest to southeast about 6 miles out, and you can pick it up as a thin grey line against the tan ground. A few ranch roads visible if you know where to look. The access road to the tower site runs north from that paved road in a straight line, and the gate at the road end is about 4 miles from the tower pad. It is, by most measures, a remote place to spend a working day. I had the replacement coupling in my tool bag, and the swap itself was not a complicated job. Maybe 40 minutes with the right socket wrench. I had the right socket wrench. I was most of the way through the work when the first smoke column appeared to the south-southwest. Far out, hard to judge distance on the flats, but the color was all wrong for a range fire. Black and heavy, the kind that comes off burning fuel or rubber, not dry grass. I watched it for a minute and went back to work. About 20 minutes later, a second column came up further north. A different direction entirely, a darker roll of smoke. I stood and looked at both of them at the same time. 2 separate fires at that distance, on a cool May morning with nothing particular going on, was not normal. There was a third one a bit later, barely visible on the eastern horizon, just a smear of grey that could have been weather if the sky hadn't been so clear. I finished the coupling swap, checked the torque on the fasteners, checked the cable seating and the new pulley, and started down the ladder. The radio in the company truck was my first stop at the base. I tried the office on the two-way. No answer, which can happen if the Burns office goes unstaffed. I tried the statewide channel and got static and a partial transmission, a man's voice, urgent in tone, cutting in and out. I couldn't pull a complete sentence out of it. My personal cell had 2 bars, and I got a text off to my sister in Bend asking what was happening. She didn't reply. I called, and it rang through to voicemail. The news app on my phone loaded a partial headline about incidents in Portland and a declared emergency in Multnomah County before the signal dropped. That was the full picture of information I had. I sat in the cab for about 20 minutes, trying to sort out what I was dealing with. The obvious play was to drive out to the highway and get a cleaner signal, or push on to Burns and see what was happening. 11 miles of washboard to the paved road, then another 22 into town. I turned the truck around and drove toward the gate, going slow, watching the road ahead. At about 4 miles out, I stopped. There were 3 vehicles on the 2-track ahead of me, none moving. 2 ranch pickups and a sedan I didn't recognize, all with doors open. One of the ranch trucks still had its engine running. I could hear it from where I was sitting. I could see a figure down on the ground near the sedan, motionless, face down. And there were 3 more figures in the middle of the track between me and the stopped vehicles, maybe 200 yards out. And the way they were moving was what stopped me cold. They weren't walking with any direction to them. They weren't running. They moved at a steady pace that didn't change for terrain or obstacles. No adjustment, no hesitation. One of them went over a patch of rough ground, the same way it went over the smooth ground. Another walked straight into a fence line and pushed against it until the wire gave, and kept going. I had the truck in reverse before I'd made a decision about it. I backed up until I had room to turn around and drove back to the tower site at the kind of speed the washboard really didn't want. I don't have a firearm in a work truck. The inventory is a tire iron, a 4-foot pry bar, a lineman's hand axe I keep for cutting cable and guide wire, and whatever happens to be in my tool bag. None of that changes what I saw in front of me on the access road in any useful way. Whatever those people were doing, whatever was wrong with them, 3 hand tools were not going to sort it out, and I had no frame of reference for what I'd just seen. I went back to the tower because it was the only ground I knew. At the tower base, I tried the radio again and got the emergency broadcast channel cycling an automated message: stay in place, await emergency services, do not use roads unless necessary. Under it, briefly, was a live voice transmission that I could only pull pieces of. I caught the words I-84 corridor and Ontario, and something that might have been confirmed multiple before it dissolved into noise. My phone was down to 1 bar. I sent another text to my sister. I called my supervisor. Neither got through. I stood in the equipment shelter doorway and looked at the road north and south and tried to think through what I had in front of me. The shelter inventory was the first thing I actually catalogued with any care. 3 days of food from my pack, 4 sandwiches, a box of granola bars, a bag of trail mix, some crackers, 4 liters of drinking water in bottles. First aid kit bolted to the wall, standard construction site type, bandages, antiseptic, a few over-the-counter pain tablets. On the material shelf, 2 rolls of heavy-duty poly sheeting, a partial box of 2-inch self-tapping screws, 3 sheet metal blanks left over from some previous visit, a can of penetrating oil, the hand crank winch on the back wall with its cable already loaded and good to go now that the upper coupling was fixed. On a wooden rack along the side wall, 2 coils of steel binding wire, maybe 100 feet each, and several lengths of tension cable. And outside the shelter, stacked against the back wall under a weathered poly tarp, were 7 salvaged catwalk grate sections from a previous maintenance run, each roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, steel bar grating in a welded frame, about 40 pounds apiece. Somebody had hauled them out and never used them. I thought about the road. The vehicles I'd seen were roughly 4 miles out. On foot, if those people moved at a slow walking pace, 4 miles was maybe 2 hours. I didn't know if there were more of them, or if they'd stay on the road or spread into the surrounding terrain. What I kept coming back to was the ladder. The ladder ran up the north face of the tower, 60+ years old, bolted to the main structure, caged. It was not a complicated piece of infrastructure. Any person who wanted to climb it could climb it. The question was whether the people I'd seen on the road could or would. and I genuinely did not know. What I did know was that nothing I'd seen had climbed anything. The ones that had pushed through the fence had done it by walking into it, not by understanding fences. That was not the same thing as a ladder, but it was a data point. I started loading the winch line and sending material up within the hour. Poly sheeting went first, bundled tight, then the sheet metal blanks, then the box of screws. Second pass on the winch, the binding wire coils. I carried the food and water up by hand in my pack. 3 trips, and my shoulders were done by the third one. The 4 lightest great sections I rigged to the winch 2 at a time, using a piece of channel iron as a spreader bar, so they'd ride flat and not catch the structure going up. The 3 heaviest I left on the ground. By late afternoon, I had material staged at the 160 platform, and I started laying it out. The existing platform was 8 by 4 feet. I used 2 great sections to extend it out along the cross members in each direction, lashing them to the structural steel, with the binding wire running the wire through the great holes and wrapping the angle iron cord, twisting tight with a bolt through the loop. It held when I put weight on it. I added the 3rd section across the outer edge to bring the total area to roughly 8 by 10 feet. It was not pretty, but it was solid. For a roof, I stretched the poly sheeting across the corner of the framework above me, tying off to the upper cord on each side, and weighted the edges with the sheet metal blanks bent over the steel. It was a lean-to roof more than an enclosure open on 2 sides, but it would deflect rain and cut the direct sun. I pulled up the food and water, tied the pack to the inner rail, set out the granola bars and water next to where I was going to sleep, and got myself sorted for the night. I ate 1 sandwich and 2 granola bars and drank half a liter of water. I tied a length of binding wire around the ladder cage at the base of my platform, a simple loop that would catch and jingle if someone grabbed the cage rungs below the platform level. Not a real deterrent, but an alarm of sorts. Then I sat with my back to the structural diagonal and watched the valley as the sun went down. There were 9 separate smoke columns by evening. 2 of them were large and building. The one farthest north was in the direction of Burns, maybe 25 miles from my position, and that one burned all night. Long after dark, I could see it as a steady orange glow on the northern horizon, faint but consistent. The gunfire I'd been half aware of since afternoon. I'd been telling myself it was distant, thunder, because that was easier, went intermittent through the evening, and dropped to near nothing after dark. 1 long burst, somewhere to the northwest, maybe 2 hours after sundown. Then nothing. I stayed awake all of that first night. Around 3 in the morning, a vehicle came down the access road without headlights, which told me right away it wasn't someone looking for help. People looking for help use their headlights. It stopped at the gate. I could hear the chain rattle as someone tried it. The chain held. After about a minute, the vehicle drove off back the way it had come. I watched the road for the rest of the night and didn't sleep until around 6 in the morning. Second day. Down the ladder at first light, moving quiet. The road was empty in both directions, as far as I could see. I drove the truck around the back side of the shelter, tucked it where it wasn't visible from the road, and retrieved the tire iron, the pry bar, and the hand axe from the cab, which I hauled up to the platform. I spent most of that day watching. The gunfire on day 2 came from further away, and by mid-afternoon it was sporadic. By evening it was gone. When gunfire stops, you can't assume the problem is solved. You have to assume the people doing the shooting either ran out of what they needed to continue, or they stopped being able to continue. Those are not the same thing, and neither of them is a good outcome. Day 3, I made the decision to stay. I'll put it as plain as I can. On day 3, the facts were, the nearest town was 33 miles by road. I had no working communications. I had seen people in a condition that made approaching them dangerous, and the gunfire that suggested some kind of organized response to whatever was happening was now gone. Going down the road meant moving towards something I couldn't see the full shape of, alone, in a truck that would be heard from half a mile in any direction. Staying in the tower meant I was visible from a long way off, but I was also 160 feet off the ground, and nothing I had seen was climbing. When I lay out the choices that way, it seems obvious. In real time, it took me until mid-morning to stop thinking about driving out. Late on day 3, I got my first clear look at the problem up close. A group of 4 people came through the sagebrush east of the access road, moving south. 2 of them were walking normally purposeful, watching where they were going, one carrying something over the shoulder. 2 were not. The 2 that weren't moved at a pace that didn't vary, same stride over rough ground as over smooth. No reaction to a low shrub that scraped across one of their legs. No reaction to a jackrabbit that flushed out from under cover right in front of one of them. The 2 normal people didn't look back at the other 2. They knew they were there and didn't engage with them. One of the wrong-moving ones walked into a length of old fence wire strung along a post line and got tangled, and stood there cycling its legs without looking down at what had it, without any reaction that made sense. It worked free after about 2 minutes and kept going. I started using the word drifters in my head for the ones with the bad movement, because that was what they were doing. Drifting. No intent in the usual sense, no direction checking, no navigation. They moved toward disturbance, sound, and motion, but without urgency, without strategy. They came, they kept coming, they didn't stop for normal reasons. That was what I had from 3 days of observation. I built my decisions around it, and kept adjusting as I learned more. Day 5, I went back to the truck for a proper search. I'd been avoiding the ground during daylight because sound carried, and I didn't want to pull anything toward the site. But the water situation was going to become critical faster than the food situation, and I needed to do something. I got down before dawn and worked by headlamp. Behind the back seat, I found a 12-pack of bottled water. I'd completely forgotten about it, had been rolling around back there for at least a week. I also found a box of protein bars jammed behind the passenger seat. 8 bars, sealed. The floor mats, the spare jacket from behind the seat, the jumper cables, an emergency triangle kit, a partial roll of duct tape. I hauled it all up in 2 trips before first light and felt better about the next 2 weeks. The second supply run happened on day 7. I drove. There was a cattle ranch I'd passed on the way to the tower site, turn off about 8 miles northeast, and I'd noticed the main outbuilding from the road large, metal-sided, the kind that functions as a combined storage barn and shop. I went out before dawn and got there without seeing anything on the road in either direction. The ranch house was empty and partially burned on the east side. The roof over the kitchen and bedroom caved in. The shop building was intact. Inside, 4 50-pound sacks of cattle mineral supplement I couldn't use, a riding mower, 3 5-gallon gas cans, 2 full 1 empty, 2 propane camping stoves with 4 fuel canisters, several coils of nylon rope in assorted diameters, a 100-foot garden hose still in the original box, and about 30 cans of food in a cabinet: vegetables, beans, soup, beef stew, along with a 2-pound bag of rice and a 1-pound bag of dried black beans someone had stored separately in a sealed container. There was a large plastic rain barrel in the corner, maybe 45 gallons, about half full of collected water, with a fitted lid. I loaded what I could into the truck bed, wrestling the rain barrel in over the tailgate with a lot of effort and making a mess of water across the truck floor. The rain barrel alone took about 10 minutes and most of my strength. On the way back out through the ranch yard, a drifter came around the corner of the house, single one. It turned toward the truck sound and came straight in, no hesitation, steady pace. I got in and drove before it reached the truck and watched it in the mirror. It followed the tire tracks for a couple 100 feet before veering off to the west, responding to something I couldn't see or hear from the cab. The useful thing I took from that moment was confirmation of what I'd been observing from the platform. They tracked sound, they tracked movement, and they didn't have the ability to think ahead of where the noise was. Once I was far enough ahead, I was already gone. I made 3 more ground runs in the following 2 weeks. A second ranch site to the south, which gave me another gas can, a tarp, and some hand tools. The BLM maintenance yard about 6 miles north on a dirt road I knew from previous work, which was the most useful stop of all. I found a heavy canvas equipment tarp, a propane camp heater with 2 full bottles, a case of drinking water sealed in plastic wrap, 2 sleeping bags in a duffel bag, 3 large aluminum equipment toolboxes I emptied for their hardware contents, and at the bottom of a shelf behind the toolboxes, still in its original cardboard box, a manual come-along winch rated at £2 to £1,000. Then a rural gas station at a crossroads about 12 miles out, mostly picked through, but I found a display rack of road snacks at the back that had been overlooked: trail mix, beef jerky, energy bars, packs of crackers, maybe 6 pounds of shelf-stable food in a rotating wire rack that someone had pushed to the corner. I took the whole rack. The come-along from the BLM yard changed the platform construction entirely. The equipment shelter winch was rated for maybe 500 pounds with a slow hand crank. The come-along, rigged to the upper structure through the existing cable guide, gave me pulling power that let me haul up the remaining heavy grate sections and eventually the sheet metal panel pieces I'd need for winter enclosure. I spent 6 full days on platform work over the next 3 weeks, and I want to describe what got built because it matters to understanding what happened after. The tower structure above the 160 platform has 2 main cross members running parallel, about 6 feet apart, each made of 2-inch angle iron welded to the main vertical cords at the 140 and 160 levels. These form a natural frame for extending the platform outward, using the come-along to raise the remaining grate sections, 2 at a time. Rigged to the cable with wire rope clips I'd found in the toolbox hardware, I was able to extend the floor in both directions along the cross members, bringing the total area to roughly 8 feet by 14 feet. I lashed every section down with multiple passes of the binding wire, cross-tied wherever possible. On the outer edge, I bent and bolted sheet metal blanks into low rail sections about 18 inches high. Not enough to stop a fall in the dark, but enough to feel. On the north side, where the prevailing weather came from, I built a windbreak using the heavy canvas tarp from the BLM yard, stretched over a frame of conduit pieces I'd cut and bent into a simple A shape, tied off to the upper cord above me. Along the uphill edge of the roof, I ran the garden hose and routed it down the tower structure to the rain barrel on a ground-level ledge I'd made out of a cut plank bolted to the lower cross members. When it rained, water running off the canvas roof would go into the hose, go down the hose, go into the barrel. Not an efficient system, not a clean one, but water is water. By the end of June, I had at 160 feet, a sleeping area about 6 by 8 feet under the canvas roof section. The 2 BLM sleeping bags laid on a base of cut foam, salvaged from the truck seat cushion. A cooking area with the 2 camp stoves on a sheet metal plate bolted to the grating, backed by a bent aluminum windshield on 3 sides. The rain barrel rigged below, with the garden hose tap running up to a valve at platform level. The come-along and the original winch line both operational for supply hauls. The food cache stored in the aluminum toolboxes, lashed to the outer east rail. The pry bar, tire iron, and hand axe stored under the sleeping area, a work area on the south end of the platform where I kept the rigging hardware, the remaining binding wire, and the basic toolkit. Food remained the primary pressure, 90-odd cans, plus the dry goods and snacks from the various runs. Supplementing that from the environment was harder than I'd expected. The high desert around Foxtrot 9-1 is not a rich landscape for casual food sourcing without a firearm. There are deer, rabbits, and birds, but the only equipment I had for taking any of them was patience and cleverness, and I hadn't worked out a trap design that I trusted. I ate what I had and kept careful count. Water from rain catchment and occasional trips to the ground with containers when the barrel ran low. I boiled everything I wasn't sure about and set the remainder to cool in sealed containers. Summer passed in a rhythm of watching, rationing, and working. I made 4 more ground runs between July and September. The BLM storage annex I'd found on the first run had a second outbuilding I'd missed, a low sheet metal lean-to at the back of the yard that contained, among other things, rigid foam insulation panels in 4 by 8 sheets that someone had stored for a building project, a partial roll of house wrap, and 2 boxes of foam in a can spray sealant. There was a church in a small community 12 miles west that I visited twice. The first time there were 3 drifters in the parking lot, and I left. The second time the lot was clear, and I went in and found the food pantry storage room, which gave me another 40-some cans, plus several bags of dry pasta and dried lentils. A farm supply store, about 15 miles northeast, had been picked through pretty thoroughly, but still had animal feed, water treatment tablet packets in a locked display case. I opened with the pry bar and 2 large spools of heavy-gauge fence wire I wanted for structural reinforcement work. I didn't see another living person until day 32. A truck came down the access road mid-morning, going slow and careful. 2 people visible in the cab, a woman driving, a man in the passenger seat. They stopped at the tower gate and looked around. The man got out and looked at the tower. He looked up the tower structure, but not far enough and not long enough to pick out the platform. Then he looked at the equipment shelter, walked to the door, tried the handle. I'd padlocked it from inside so there was nothing to find, and went back to the truck. They drove off going south down the access road. I watched them until the dust settled. I did not signal them. I want to be direct about why. The platform at that point could keep me fed and sheltered at current consumption. It could not keep 3 people fed and sheltered. That was the arithmetic. I spent 3 days revisiting it before I let it settle. The drifters in the area changed through the summer in ways I tracked from the platform. In the first weeks, there were consistently 2 or 3 visible from the 160 level at any time in the surrounding terrain. By July, that number was down. I saw one early in August that I'd been seeing regularly since May. I identified it by the bright orange ranch vest it still had on, and it was moving the same as it always had. Same pace, same directionlessness. One afternoon in mid-August, it walked into the old stock fence line along the east side of the property and bumped against the posts multiple times over about an hour before working through an open gate section it had apparently never located in all its previous passes. On a different afternoon, one came to the base of the tower and put both hands on the ladder rungs, not climbing, feet still on the ground. No weight transfer, just pulling at the rungs with a motion that was more like testing than intentional climbing. I watched it for 40 minutes. It never got its feet onto the first rung. It eventually turned and walked toward the road in response to something I couldn't identify, but both hands had been on the ladder, and I had not planned for that. In late May, I had added a wire barrier to the lower ladder section, angle iron pieces cross-lashed across the bottom, 8 rungs with fence wire, creating a grid that required hands capable of manipulating a tool to get through. I'd built it because of the one in the orange vest that kept circling. Seeing the hand-on-rung moment in August made me glad I'd done it, and I went back over my lashings on the barrier carefully the following morning. Everything held. In August, a second vehicle came, a big crew cab pickup towing a flatbed trailer with gear stacked and tarped. 3 people, 2 men, and a woman. They came through the gate with a bolt cutter, drove in, and set up camp in the lee of the equipment shelter. They were organized and efficient. Unpacking and setting up took them under an hour. They used the interior of the shelter for dry storage, pulling their tarped gear off the trailer and stacking it inside. For 4 days they camped within 20 feet of the tower base and never once looked up. Not once. I could hear pieces of their conversations in the still air. An older man was pushing to go north toward the Columbia River. A woman was arguing for staying in the high desert because the low population density meant fewer drifters. The younger man mostly listened. On day 3 they had a significant argument about someone named Boyce who hadn't shown up. On day 4 they loaded everything back onto the trailer and drove north without Boyce. I watched them go and then sat for a while with the food count in my head. At the consumption rate I'd been maintaining, roughly 12 to 1500 calories a day, and with the stock I had cached in the toolboxes and additional bins I'd built from scrap wood, I had approximately 7 months of food. That was manageable, but only if I kept sourcing through the fall and didn't lose any supply to spoilage or weather damage. The more immediate problem was winter. 2 sleeping bags rated to 20 degrees, the camp heater, 4 propane bottles remaining after summer use, and a shelter structure that was not remotely closed against an eastern Oregon January. At 4,000 feet elevation in this part of the state, January nights regularly hit single digits or below. The canvas tarp roof section was already showing grommets pulling loose from one summer of wind events. It was not going to survive a winter. September and October, I ran hard on supply gathering and construction. 5 ground runs in those 2 months. The hardware store in the small town 15 miles east was the most important stop. I found corrugated steel roofing panels in 4-foot sections in a storage area at the back, and rigid foam insulation boards on a damaged rack, and angle iron in the fastener aisle, and enough miscellaneous hardware to fill a bag. There were 4 drifters in the parking lot on my first visit. I ran the truck in close, let them track toward me, drove around to the rear loading dock, where I had separation, propped the back door with a toolbox, and worked inside for about 30 minutes. Coming out with a loaded hand dolly, 2 of them had come around the back corner. I left the dolly, drove around to the front, and had to do 2 more passes to recover the full load. On the 3rd pass there were 6 of them. I took what I had loaded and counted it enough. By mid-October the sleeping area was enclosed on 3 sides, with the corrugated roofing panels over a frame of angle iron I'd bolted to the existing structural members. 2 layers of foam board on the north and west faces. The roof was a double-layer corrugated section sloped east, so rain and snowmelt would run off to the right and not pool. I left the east face open for visibility. The drop-off on that side is clear, and I wanted to be able to see what was on the ground below without obstruction. The camp heater went inside along the west wall with a 6-inch vent hole cut through the panel and a vent pipe made from a coffee tin and a section of electrical conduit running 2 feet outside the wall before turning upward. It was not a proper installation by any standard I'd been trained to, but it was what I had, and the conduit gave some separation. First winter, I'll go through it straight. November was cold but workable. I was still able to get down and make short runs for anything I identified as a critical gap. More water treatment tablets, another tarp I found rolled in a barn I'd passed before, a hand pump for the rain barrel that made drawing water easier. I made 4 runs in November, and after that pulled back. The ground conditions and the reduced daylight made it more difficult, and I'd gotten the supply to a level I could work with through the winter if I was careful. The ladder nearly ended things in November. I came down on a morning after a night of rain and near freezing temperatures, and the rungs had a coat of ice. 3rd rung from the bottom, my boot slipped. I caught the cage hoop with my forearm and stopped falling, maybe 4 rungs down in total. But my left hand came down across the edge of the angle iron ladder side rail and tore the skin across 2 knuckles and bent my glove in a way that told me I'd hit it hard. I sat at the base of the tower for about 20 minutes before climbing back up. After that I scraped the rungs with the hatchet blade before every descent in cold weather, and I went down slow with 3 points of contact at all times. The knuckle cuts did not close well in the cold. They were still open in January. Food through first winter I managed at roughly 1,200 calories a day on the worst stretch, going up on days I was doing physical work. Canned goods mostly, the rice and dried beans cooked on the camp stove and stretched as far as possible, the dry pasta, the protein bars parceled out at 1 per day maximum. Water was rain catchment plus snowmelt. I left pans out on the east side of the platform uncovered, flat, angled slightly, and brought them in once they had a few inches of snow. Melting snow on the stove, and then boiling used propane. I tracked every bottle carefully. 1 full bottle at my run rate lasted approximately 9 days of use, 4 hours each night and 1 hour each morning. With 11 bottles going into winter, that was 99 days. Winter at that elevation runs from early November to mid-March in hard terms. That was cutting it. I went down to 3 hours a night in the coldest weeks and put on everything I owned for the sleeping period. In December, I started narrating what I was doing, not to anyone, just out loud, to myself. Opening the west toolbox, counting the bean cans, heating about 1 liter of melt water. It started as a check on whether I was doing things in the right order, because I'd caught myself twice starting to do something and then stopping with no memory of what the next step was. Saying the steps out loud kept them organized. After a few weeks, it became a habit. I heard my voice a lot during that winter. It sounded different from what I remembered, rougher and slower. January brought the platform failure I'd been putting off dealing with since the fall. One of the great sections I'd added in the early weeks, third from the south end, east side had only 2 lashing points on the uphill edge. I'd run short of binding wire at the time and told myself I'd fix it later. In January, after a significant snow load followed by partial melt and refreeze, the unsecured corner dropped. I was in the sleeping bag when it happened, woke to a shifting sensation. The dropped corner had swung down maybe 18 inches and was held by the 2 remaining passes of wire. I got up with the headlamp at 2 in the morning in -12 wind chill and spent 2 hours relashing it with the fence wire I'd brought up in October. Every inch of exposed skin on my hands took damage in that session. The knuckle cuts from November tore back open. I wrapped them with the last of the first aid kit bandaging material and kept working. The lashing held once I was done and has not moved since. There were drifters even in deep winter. Not many, but they did not stop. The cold seemed to slow them slightly. Their movement patterns were more erratic in January, less consistent in direction, but they kept moving. One that I'd been tracking periodically since autumn, recognizable by the remnants of a bright green safety vest, passed the tower base 3 times in January, always between roughly 10 in the morning and noon, always from southwest to northeast. I had no explanation for why it kept coming through the same terrain, in the same direction, at the same time of day. There was nothing I could identify northeast of the tower site for miles. Whatever was pulling it, I couldn't see it. February was the worst month of the first winter. I ran low on propane in the second week of February, down to 1.5 bottles, which was maybe 13 days at reduced use. I had 14 days left until I expected the temperatures to start trending reliably above 0 overnight. I went to 2 hours of heat per night, then 1.5. The last 4 nights before the temperature shifted, I ran the heater for 45 minutes at bedtime and then let it go out. I was in both sleeping bags with every piece of clothing I had. I got through it. When the first night stayed above 10 degrees and held there, I sat on the east side of the platform in the morning light for a long time, not doing anything. Spring came slow, and then fast, in the way eastern Oregon springs do. 2 weeks of mud and cold rain, and then overnight, the sage was green, and the sky turned that particular color of high desert blue. I started moving again. The truck battery was dead by March, killed by the cold, and by my decision to bring the jumper cables up to the platform in January, rather than leave them where they were useful. I had to write off the truck as transportation. That changed everything about supply runs. On foot, I could carry 40 pounds comfortably in a pack, maybe 60 in a hard push, and I could cover 8 to 10 miles in a day over the mixed terrain around the tower site, closer to 15 on a good road. Anything I wanted to bring back had to come from within that radius. I built a sled from the truck's rear tailgate in March, used the angle grinder, kept charged on a small solar panel I'd found at the BLM yard, to cut the mounting brackets free and drop the gate, drilled holes in the front edge, ran rope handles through them, lashed a pair of bent steel rods to the underside for runners. On flat dirt, I could drag 80 pounds on it without losing too much time. On gravel, it made a terrible sound. I used it on 3 runs in March and April to bring in additional supplies, more corrugated panel pieces, a bag of sand for filtration in the water system, additional propane from a ranch outbuilding. I found 6 miles south that had never been on my prior route. The second summer brought a different situation on the ground. More people moving, but in larger and more organized groups. In May, a group of 7 came through on the access road with a horse-drawn cart. The horse was the first one I'd seen since the outbreak, and it looked in reasonable condition, which meant someone had been feeding and caring for it through the winter. They camped at the tower site for 2 nights. The first morning, one of them pointed up at the platform. The whole group looked. They talked among themselves. Nobody tried the ladder. The second morning, a young man came to the tower base and called up. I called back. He asked if I wanted to come down, and I said no. He asked why, and I said I was set up, and it was working. He stood there for a moment, and then went back to the group. When they left the next morning, they left a canvas bag at the bottom of the ladder. In it, a block of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a bag of dried apple slices, and a handwritten note that said, "Stay safe. Kerrigan Group, moving NW, Klamath Route." I ate the cheese over 3 days and wrote Kerrigan Group in the back of my site maintenance log. Second summer, I made 14 ground runs, the highest count of any period. I pushed the radius out as far as I could manage in a single day, up to 12 miles on good road, 9 on rough terrain. The food cache at the 160 mark reached what I counted as 14 months of supply at my average consumption. I found and hauled up a second propane camp heater, 9 more propane bottles, additional foam board insulation, a case of motor oil I had no use for, and traded out immediately for the space, a winter-rated sleeping bag to replace the one with the scorch mark from an incident I'll describe shortly, and, on the last run of the summer, a manual hand pump, deep well type, that I couldn't use, but kept because the mechanical knowledge in it was something I could learn from. I also found, at a second small ranch operation about 7 miles west, a root cellar that had gone unvisited. Inside were potatoes gone bad mostly, but also a 50-pound bag of dried corn, a case of home-canned tomatoes in sealed jars, and about 30 pounds of dried beans in sealed 5-gallon buckets. I had to make 3 separate trips to clear it out. November of the second year is when the fire happened. The second camp heater, the one I'd found that summer, had a regulator fitting with a worn O-ring. I hadn't caught it when I first brought it into service in October because the seep was slow and only happened under certain pressure conditions. I ran it for 3 weeks without issue. On a night in early November, temperature outside at about 15 degrees, I had both heaters running at low output for the first time. The sleeping enclosure was taking longer to warm up than usual, and I decided to run them together for an hour before sleep. I went to sleep with both running. I came awake to an orange brightness and a smell. The east interior face of the enclosure, the foam board panel on that wall, was burning. Foam board burns fast and produces heavy black smoke, and in an enclosed space, that smoke is a serious problem in seconds. I came out of the sleeping bag and grabbed the second heater by the steel body and threw it through the open east face of the enclosure, picked up my water container, about 2 liters, and put it on the burning foam. Not enough. The fire had already moved to the corrugated panel above. I took my boot off and beat the panel repeatedly until the foam stopped burning. Total time, I estimate 2.5 to 3 minutes from the moment I woke up. I spent an hour after that in the open 15-degree air, going over every surface I could reach to confirm there was no smoldering. Damage. The east interior foam panel was gone entirely. The corrugated panel above it was warped, and one section had a small hole burned through. The sleeping bag had a 6-inch scorch mark where an ember had landed when I stood up. The second heater had landed on the grating outside the enclosure and was mechanically intact. The steel shell protected the gas components, but I did not trust the regulator fitting and did not put it back into service. I was down to 1 heater and 9 bottles of propane for the second winter. The east wall repair I did with the truck floor mats. I cut them to fit the frame opening, screwed them over the burned area through pre-drilled holes using the self-tapping screws, and sealed the edges with the foam in a can spray. Rubber mats are not insulation. They smelled in the heat, and they were cold to the touch in the frost. But they cut the wind, and they were there, which was the important part. I ordered the propane use down to 3 hours a night for the second winter, 2 hours before sleep, and 1 hour in the morning, and added a windbreak of extra sleeping bag material, stuffed into the open space on the east side, on the coldest nights. Second winter was colder than first winter at the platform level, or at least it felt that way with the degraded east wall. The enclosure was not holding heat as efficiently. I was in 2 pairs of pants, 3 shirts, the work jacket, and the watch cap for the sleeping hours from November through January. Food consumption I held to about 1,200 calories a day, average, occasionally dropping to 1,000 on fully still days when I didn't need the fuel. The supply math was workable. The propane math was tighter than I'd liked, but it moved in the right direction as the winter progressed. The February group came on the 8th of the month. 2 vehicles, a pickup, and an older 4-wheel drive Suburban, 6 adults, arriving in the mid-morning and setting up camp in the open ground between the shelter and the road. They had a wood stove, a small cast-iron box-type setup, and running within an hour of arrival, with a double-wall stovepipe running up through a hole they cut in the side of a tarp shelter they'd strung between the 2 vehicles. They had a water filtration unit in a rigid plastic housing, purpose-built, the kind you'd see from a serious outdoor outfitter. They had a watch rotation, 2 people always alert while the others rested or worked. They knew what they were doing. They did not look up. Day 1, I watched all 6 of them. 2 men in their 40s or 50s, heavy-set one in a canvas work coat, the other lean with a close-cut beard. 2 women, one closer to 30 with a bandana around her neck, one older, maybe 60, who moved slowly but efficiently and never stopped working. A younger man, early 20s, who did whatever the heavy-set one told him without pushing back. And a 6th person I couldn't get a clear look at for the first day, because he mostly stayed inside the Suburban. Day 2, a woman came out of the equipment shelter carrying one of the old coax cable spools I'd left there. She looked it over, set it outside, and went back in. She was directly below me, maybe 15 feet. Day 3, the heavy-set man and the lean woman had an argument near the shelter about the road south. He gestured south repeatedly. She pointed east. It went on for a while. Eventually, he sat down on the coke spool and she walked away. Day 4, the grey-bearded man who did the evening perimeter walk, the 6th person, who I'd finally seen clearly by this point, came within about 10 feet of the tower base. He examined the base pad, walked around the shelter, looked at the dead truck. He opened the truck door, looked inside, closed it. He was thorough, and he was careful. He did not look up. I've thought about why. From directly below a lattice tower, the structure is busy cross members and diagonals stacked up your field of view in a way that makes it hard to separate what's structural from what's added. The platform, with its corrugated walls and dark canvas, reads as part of the tower structure if you're not looking for it specifically. The winch line runs along the back face of the tower, out of the immediate sightline from the front. In winter light, with a grey sky, the whole upper structure fades, and people in hard circumstances narrow their focus to what's at eye level and ground level, because that's where the problems come from. That's not a criticism of them, it's accurate. I do the same thing on the ground. You look at roads, at movement, at the nearest buildings. You do not tilt your head back and study the upper sections of a rusted lattice tower on a cold February morning when you have 6 other things to track. Day 5, they sorted their water supplies and checked the vehicles. Day 6, they loaded up and drove north. I watched the dust from the vehicles for 4 minutes before it settled. I climbed down for the first time in 11 days after they left and walked the site. They'd been careful, not much waste, no major disorder. They'd left a partial bag of charcoal near where the wood stove had been, 2 empty glass jars, a piece of canvas they'd used as a ground sheet. I took the canvas. At the base of the ladder, I found that the heavy-set man had at some point sat on the lower crosspiece of my wire and angle iron ladder barrier and bent it down about 2 inches. I got the pry bar and straightened it before going back up. March. The days are getting longer. The temperature is up above, freezing most afternoons, and the ground is starting to open up. I've done 2 short runs since the February group left, both on foot with the sled, East Road, 6 miles out and back. Found a sealed bag of beef jerky in the cab of an abandoned pickup parked in a ditch. The bag was intact, and the jerky was fine. Brought it back, logged it, added it to the count. The drifter count in the visible terrain has dropped significantly from both previous years. 2 years ago, on any given day, I could pick out 2 or 3 of them in the surrounding area. Now I sometimes go a full day without seeing one. Some of them I've watched go into situations they couldn't navigate out of irrigation ditches, soft-banked stock ponds, fields of rough basalt rubble. They don't last indefinitely without the systems that keep a body going. That process is slow, but it is happening. I can't call it a trend or a solution, because I don't know what I'm not seeing across a wider geography. What I can say is that the operational terrain around this specific tower site is becoming less complicated to move through than it was. I did a full tower inspection in late February. Base anchor bolts, guy wire tension, condition of the welded connections on the main cords, corrosion check on the lower sections. 2 cord sections at about the 20-foot level have surface rust that I've treated with the penetrating oil. The welds on the platform extension, the ones I added back in the first weeks, are clean. No cracking, no movement, no sign of fatigue in the lashings. The tower was built to last, and it has. 60+ years and counting. My maintenance log is in the back of the site binder. I found in the shelter a brown wire-bound book with the FAA site designation printed on the cover, and about 40 pages of pre-printed maintenance forms, followed by blank pages. I've been writing in the blank section since October of the first year. 247 entries. Most one line. Weather, temperature, what I ate, what I observed. A few longer. The entry for the night of the fire is about a page. The entry for the day the Kerrigan group left is 3 lines. The entry for the night the platform section dropped is half a page, because I wrote down every step of the repair in case I needed to repeat it. My hands are not what they were. The knuckle damage from the first winter ladder fall never healed fully in the cold. The skin came back thinner and pulls tight in the cold mornings, cracking sometimes if I don't keep it out of the wind. My palms are heavily calloused from the ladder and the wire work. I've lost about 20 pounds from my pre-outbreak weight, by estimate, and most of what's left is functional. I can carry more than I could a year ago, because I'm not carrying anything extra. I've been thinking about the Kerrigan Group's note. NW, Klamath Route. The Klamath Basin and the territory around it is a long way from here, probably 300 miles by any road route that avoids the obvious problem areas. On foot, with a sled, that's a significant undertaking. But the Klamath country is high, remote, and has historically supported ranching operations. If the Kerrigan Group made it and held together, there's a reasonable chance there's something there that's worth moving toward. The supply math works for 1 more winter at the platform. After that, the options narrow, and moving while I'm in decent physical condition is better than moving when I'm not. For now, the tower holds, the platform holds. The food cache is counted and secured. There is water in the barrel, and 3 weeks of propane remaining. The days are longer every morning. The east rail bolt is working loose again. I noticed it yesterday, and I'll address that this morning before anything else. The wrench is where it always is, in the south end tool bin. I know exactly how many turns that bolt needs. I've tightened it 4 times since I built that section of rail. Some things you just keep doing. I want to go back and fill in some of the blanks I skipped over in the early part of this account, because the sequence of how I understood what was happening matters. In the first week, I had essentially no information. The automated emergency broadcast was the only organized communication I could pull on the 2-way, and it cycled the same message: continuously stay in place, await services, which told me that whoever had recorded it had believed the situation was going to be temporary and manageable. The partial live transmissions I caught in the first 2 days were fragmented, and I could not piece together a coherent picture from them. On day 4, my phone died entirely, battery gone, and I had no way to charge it. After that, I had no connection to any broader information. What I knew about the outbreak, I built entirely from observation. The most useful observation sessions were in the first 2 weeks, when I still had regular drifters visible from the platform and could watch them for extended periods without interference. I kept a running list of what I could confirm versus what I was guessing. Confirmed early. They moved towards sound and motion. They did not stop at normal obstacles they pushed through or around. They did not respond to pain signals in any recognizable way. They did not rest. They did not coordinate with each other. Two of them could pass within arm's length without reacting to each other, both tracking the same noise source independently. They were slow, faster than a shuffling walk, but not a run. Maybe 2 to 3 miles an hour on flat ground, slower on difficult terrain. Guessing early, whether cold or heat affected them, whether they could see at night as well as day, whether they had any capacity for learning or adaptation. By the end of summer, I'd answered most of the guesses. Cold slowed them somewhat, but did not stop them. I confirmed night movement in July, when I watched one navigate around the corner of the equipment shelter, in full dark, with no visible light source, moving directly toward where I'd dropped a metal fitting that had clanged on the concrete pad. Heat did not seem to affect them the way it would a person. I saw them moving through 90-degree afternoons without any change in behavior. Night vision, or something like it, appeared to be functional. Learning or adaptation. I found no evidence of it over 2 full years. The one in the orange vest moved through the same terrain, in the same patterns in February of year 2, as it had in July of year 1. There was no process happening that I could identify as adjustment or improvement. Whatever they were doing the same thing from the start. One thing I got wrong initially was the assumption that noise was always a risk. Noise brought them toward a source, but it also moved them away from where they'd been, which was sometimes more useful than silence. On my early ground runs, I was very quiet, engine off whenever possible, doors closed gently, no talking. On a run in August, I knocked over a 5-gallon bucket in a barn I was working through and froze, waiting for a reaction. Nothing came. I eventually realized I was half a mile from anything I'd last seen moving, and the noise hadn't carried far enough to matter. After that, I calibrated loud engine noise in open country was a problem. A dropped bucket in an enclosed building was usually not. Context changed the risk. The most important ground run I never planned was in early October of the first year, about 3 weeks before I planned to stop making runs for the winter. I was coming back from the farm supply store run with the fence wire spools on the sled, about 4 miles from the tower, when I saw a building I'd passed 6 or 8 times before, but never entered because it was set back from the road and obscured by a collapsed lean-to on the front face. This time I went in. It was a small storage outbuilding for a property I'd thought was a vacant lot, turned out to be the back of a rural postal relay station that had been closed for years, just the building remaining. Inside, against the back wall, was a steel cabinet bolted to the studs, padlocked. I opened it with the pry bar in about 2 minutes. Inside were 12 road flares, 4 orange signal flags, a hand crank emergency radio in a case, and a full first aid kit, a proper one, not the small construction site type, with suture strips, trauma dressings, a tourniquet, eye wash, and a range of medications, still in their sealed packaging, including a full course of amoxicillin tablets in a sealed bottle. The emergency radio changed the next 2 months. I spent 3 evenings that first October working through the available frequencies, scanning systematically, and what I found was partial but meaningful. There was a broadcast station still transmitting somewhere to the west a man's voice, steady, reading what sounded like a prepared daily update. I could only catch it in fragments depending on atmospheric conditions, but over several sessions I pieced together that there was an organized group in the Willamette Valley, west of the Cascades, operating out of what he described as a consolidated site near Corvallis. He mentioned clear corridor conditions on certain roads and named a few locations that had gone dark. He also read a list of call signs and names at the end of each transmission, which I took to be a check-in roll call for other groups on some kind of network. I listened to those lists for 2 months. I heard the name Kerrigan in the list exactly once, on a transmission in November of the first year, with a note that they were in transit, last known position, Harney County. That was the only external verification I had, that the group who'd left me the note was real and accounted for. The radio battery ran out in December of the first year. I couldn't recharge it. The solar panel I had was a small one, 6 watts, adequate to keep my angle grinder and headlamp batteries topped up, but not large enough to charge the radio's internal battery in the limited winter sunlight. I tried several times and got partial charges that lasted maybe 20 minutes of use before the radio cut out. After January, I stopped trying. The solar panel I preserved carefully because the angle grinder was essential for fabrication work and I had no other power source for it. Late spring of the second year, I spent 4 days repairing and improving things I'd deferred through the winter. The east wall foam replacement was the main item I'd been without it since November. I found a source of rigid foam board at a collapsed outbuilding about 3 miles east that I hadn't visited before, a property that had been some kind of rural processing operation. The foam was water damaged on the outside edges, but the inner sections were sound. I cut it to fit and redid the east interior wall properly, 2 layers with the seams offset, spray sealed at the edges. The sleeping enclosure was noticeably warmer within an hour of completing the work. I also ran the winch line inspection in April. The cable had been in service continuously for nearly a year, and the outer strands were showing wear at the upper guide. Pulley ironic, given that the whole reason I'd come to Foxtrot 91 in the first place was to replace a sheared cable coupling. The wear wasn't critical yet, but it would be. I replaced the upper pulley section with the spare hardware from the structural cache and cut the cable back 8 feet to move the worn section out of the load zone. I had a spare cable spool at the base that would extend the length back to full reach when I needed it. I noted the cable condition in the log and set a reminder to check it again every 3 months. The second summer's 14 runs added one more significant find I haven't mentioned yet. A medical kit of the type that gets stocked in commercial vehicles, found in the back of a utility van at a rural electrical cooperative yard about 9 miles east. It had trauma supplies, a CPR mask, latex gloves, and a small pharmacy of over-the-counter items, plus, notably, a sealed packet of ibuprofen, a full inhaler in a sealed plastic bag, and a tube of prescription antibiotic ointment, still within its labeled use date. I'd been managing the knuckle injuries with what I had. After finding the ointment, the healing on the left hand improved noticeably within 2 weeks. Sleep quality during both winters was the thing I underestimated going in. The platform makes noise in wind, not structural noise, not the kind that tells you something is wrong, but a low-frequency vibration in the cable guys that transfers into the grating and produces a sound you feel as much as hear. You adapt to it the way you adapt to a highway near your house, but it took 3 months before it stopped waking me at irregular intervals. Combined with the cold and the rationing, the sleep pattern through both winters was fragmented. I rarely got more than 4 or 5 consecutive hours. I tried to compensate with a rest period in early afternoon when the sun was up and the temperature was manageable, lying still on the sleeping bag without necessarily sleeping. Whether that counts as rest, I'm not sure, but it helped. The one area of practical skill I built that I didn't have before this started is weather reading from altitude. At 160 feet, the sky is a different resource than it is from the ground. Cloud movement, pressure shifts, incoming fronts, you see more of the picture from up here. I started keeping weather notes in the log from early on, and by the middle of the first winter, I could call rain or heavy snow about 8 to 12 hours ahead with reasonable accuracy. That was useful for timing supply runs, for managing water catchment, and for deciding when to double peg the shelter panels before a wind event rather than after. The last thing I'll note for now is what the 2 winters in this position have done to my sense of what a problem looks like. Before this, I worked in telecommunications infrastructure. I dealt with signal loss, structural failures, equipment faults, regulatory compliance. Problems had defined parameters and known solutions. What the past 2 years have taught me is a different set of parameters. Every decision has a resource cost. Every resource has a finite quantity. Every plan has a failure mode. You do not solve the situation, you maintain the position, extend the runway, and look for the next viable move. That is not a philosophy I came in here with. It is one I built by doing the wrong thing first in enough situations to understand what the right thing looked like.